I'm here with your first Bible class video for this week, for Thanksgiving week. Happy Thanksgiving! I love Thanksgiving, and I hope you do too. I hope you have lots of fun things planned for this week. Lots of yummy things to eat and fun traditions, and maybe you are putting up Christmas decorations after Thanksgiving. Maybe you have already done that. We've already put up some of our Christmas decorations. But it's just a fun time of year, so I hope you have lots of good things planned for this week. This week is lesson 12 in our Bible workbooks. So that means we're almost done with this quarter, and it also means that you have learned about almost all of the United Kingdom. Do you remember what I mean when I say United Kingdom? That is the kingdom of Israel that was all 12 tribes together, not divided. They were together and they were led by one king. And we started at the beginning of this quarter. Remember we talked about the time period of the judges? That was not a good time for Israel, was it? Because each person did what was right in his own eyes. They were not worried about doing what God wanted them to do. They were worried about themselves and doing what they wanted. And so a lot of evil things happened during that time. And so God would lift up leaders, right? Judges is what they were called. And these judges would help to fight off Israel's enemies and then also lead them back to God. And they needed that a lot, didn't they? Because they were not following God. So we learned all about the time of the judges. And we know that at the end of the time of the judges, some Israelites came to Samuel. Samuel was 3 things. Do you remember? This is from last quarter, I think. So we'll see if you remember. He was a prophet, he was a priest, and he was a judge, the very last judge of Israel. And they came to Samuel and they said, all these other nations around us have kings, and we want to be like them. We want to have a king. And Samuel was not very happy about that because God was their king. They didn't need some guy with a crown on to be their leader. They were God's people. Samuel went to God and God said, well, they're rejecting me. They're not rejecting you, Samuel. So you can tell them they can have a king. It's not going to end very well, but they can do that. And so we learned about the very first king of Israel. His name was King Saul, right? I know you guys remember all this. This is just review. It's good to go over things that we've already learned. So King Saul was king for 40 years. And it makes me kind of sad to read about King Saul because he started off wanting to do what was right. He started off obeying God. But then he started following what he wanted and started allowing sin into his heart, and after that he wasn't so concerned about obeying God. So that's pretty sad to think about. So then we learned about the second king of Israel, King David, right? And David started out as just a humble shepherd in the field. And David trusted God, didn't he? He was very faithful to God, and he waited for God's timing. And that doesn't mean that he was perfect or that he never made mistakes. We know he made lots of pretty big mistakes, didn't he? But when he realized what he had done, he was very sorry. He repented. That means he asked God for forgiveness and he wanted to make it right. And he really loved God and wanted to do what was right to God, for God. So that's something that we can learn from David. We're not always going to do things perfectly, but when we ask God for forgiveness, he's always ready to help us make it right. So now, this week and next week, we're learning about the third king of Israel, the United Nation. And that is King Solomon. Now, Solomon was one of David's sons, of course, and toward the end of David's life, he knew that he was about to die. He knew he was getting sick and getting older, and so he told Solomon something that we've been learning as our memory verse, right? So let's say that together. This is from 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 and 3. So David gave orders to his son Solomon. He said, I'm about to die, so be strong. Do everything the Lord your God requires. Live the way he wants you to. So it was really important to David that his son Solomon obeyed God, wasn't it? I think probably David regretted some of the choices that he had made. That means he looked back on his choices and thought, I wish I hadn't done that. And I think David was trying to help his son understand how important it is to obey God. And so then David died and Solomon became king. Solomon was about 20 years old when he became king, so he was pretty young, but he loved God and he loved to worship God. Now remember, this time that we're talking about was during the Old Testament, and it was during this time that the Israelites were under the old law. That's the law that God gave to Moses after they had left Egypt, remember? So there were things that they did to worship God that are different from what we do now. So when we read about Solomon offering sacrifices or building altars or doing burnt offerings, those are not the things that we do when we say we want to worship God, but that is what God had asked them to do. Does that make sense? Solomon loved to worship God. We read over and over again about how he would go to these holy places and he would give offerings and he would offer burnt sacrifices. In fact, there's one story about how he went to a holy place and offered 1,000 burnt sacrifices. 1,000 sacrifices to God. That is a lot, isn't it? That is so many. But it was important to Solomon. He wanted to do what was right, and he wanted to show God how much he loved him. So that's what he liked to do. And that was really pleasing to God. God was pleased with Solomon and the heart that he had for doing what was right. And so one night, God came to Solomon in a dream, and he said, whatever you ask, I will give it to you. Whatever you want. That's a pretty big offer, isn't it? Have you ever thought about what you might ask for if somebody said, you could ask for anything you want and I'll give it to you? What would you ask for? Would you ask for 100 ice cream cones? Or lots of new toys? I don't know. If somebody came and asked me that, I think I would probably think, what is it that I want? But Solomon did not have thoughts for himself in his heart. He didn't think, well, what do I want for me? He told God that his father, King David, had been such a good leader, and now he was king. He said, I feel like a little kid who's walking around and doesn't know what I'm doing. Remember, he was 20 years old, so he was pretty young. And so what he asked God for, what he wanted more than anything else, was wisdom. He said, I need wisdom and I need understanding to know the difference between what's good and what's evil. And he wanted those things because he wanted to be a good king. He wanted to be a good leader for God's people. Isn't that amazing? Of all the things that he could have asked for that would have just, been awesome for him to have, what he wanted more than anything was to do right by God's people. And so God was very happy with that request. So he said, okay, I will give you wisdom and I will give you understanding, and I will also give you some other gifts too. And so Solomon became very wise, and he became very famous for being wise. People would come from all over to come listen to him speak and to ask him questions and to hear his learning, his wise answers. We read about King Solomon knowing lots of things about lots of different subjects, lots of different animals and plants, the big cedars of Lebanon and the tiny hyssop grasses. You know, he knew lots of different things because that was a gift that God had given him. And so he became well known. He became famous for being so wise. People brought him money, and so he became very, very, very rich. And so he got some of these other things too that are kind of just not as important as God's wisdom and God's understanding. Earthly things, things that were maybe good to have here on earth, but not the kinds of things that we would pray to have today, right? But that's what was given to Solomon. He gained wisdom and riches and honor, and he lived for a long time. In fact, he was king for 40 years, just like King Saul and just like King David. They were all king for 40 years. The other thing that we want to remember about King Solomon's time as king is the temple. So you probably remember learning about the Ark of the Covenant, right? That was what they carried the 10 Commandments in, right? And that they had a lot of rules that God had given them about what it should look like and how they should carry it. It was a very, very important reminder of God's laws for the Israelites. It was very special to them. And they had it in what was called the tabernacle, right? And it was like kind of a tent made of cloth, and not the kind of tent you go camping in, but just sort of a temporary building, not something that's built to last for a long, long time. It's something that can be moved from place to place. Does that make sense? So King David, while he was king, he wanted to build a temple for God, a permanent place, a permanent building to put the Ark of the Covenant and for the Israelites to come worship God. But that was not for King David to do. God told him that one of his sons would be doing it. And guess who that son was? King Solomon. So that was something that was really important to King Solomon, was that they built this temple. And it was a big job. They did not use any nails. They didn't use a hammer to build it like we might use today. They covered it with gold. It took them 7 years to build the temple. I mean, this was a big, big job. But when it was done, there was no other building on earth that was as beautiful, that had cost as much money to build. It was very awe-inspiring. When people looked at it, they went, wow, this is an amazing temple for a powerful God of the Israelites. And so once it was done, King Solomon gathered a lot of the people together and prayed to God to ask him to bless the temple and to bless all the Israelites that would be coming there to worship God. So I like to imagine what it would have been like for those Israelites. You know, they were probably thinking about how long they spent, how many years their ancestors spent as slaves in Egypt, and then what a difficult time they had when they were wandering in the desert. And then they had finally come to the promised land, but even then they had a lot of battles to fight, and went through the time of the judges, which was not a very good time, right? Lots of battles still, lots of bad things happening, but finally they were together. They were in the promised land. They had had kings leading them as God wanted them to be led, and now they had this beautiful, amazing temple where the Ark of the Covenant would stay, and it was, it was all just exactly as God had told them to build it, and it was beautiful to look at. And can you imagine the joy that they probably felt knowing that God had kept his promises to them, and they were able to come to that temple and worship God the way that he wanted them to. I think that's really nice to think about. So, I wish we could say that the Israelites continued to worship God the way that he wanted them to, but we know that they continued to make some mistakes. We're going to learn about that a little bit later on, but the things to remember about King Solomon are that he asked God for wisdom and understanding. He wanted to be a good leader for God's people, and that he built the temple as a place for the Israelites to come and worship God, and that it was something really special once it was all done. Okay, guys, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we will see you all in a little bit. Bye.